Bulabunaka, everyone. Thank you for coming. I hope everyone's had a nice lunch. My name is Jope Tarai, and I'm currently one of the struggling permanent head damage patients here at DPA as a PhD student. First, I want to acknowledge that the idea behind this panel was born by Louey. So if anybody wants to get upset at something, please be upset at her. Louey, of course, is one of our PhD students who's looking at exploring politics and sustainable discourses. And prior to that, had worked as an engagement officer with the Australian Sustainable Built Environment. Today's panel is, of course, titled Awkward AUKUS. That was born out of our well of wisdom, so to speak, aka our cover conversations, because a few students were a bit awkward about AUKUS, and we are very, very lucky that we have a panel, a cast of panelists who are quite seasoned and, of course, very much experts in this particular issue. Ever since the announcement in 2021, the AUKUS Security Partnership has sat somewhat awkwardly in the Pacific, led by three of the region's main traditional security partners, Australia, the UK, the US, as AUKUS promises to promote a secure and stable Indo-Pacific, covering an expansive maritime region in which the Pacific Islands is positioned as a strategic linchpin. For the communities and leaders of the Pacific Island communities, however, the AUKUS program has been received with a mixture of caution and unease. Pacific representatives have raised concerns on various fronts, not least regarding its securitization agenda and respect for the Pacific's proud nuclear-free position. This particular intergenerational panel is not to say that there's a difference in age, but we'll explore the relationship between AUKUS, again, blame Pip, Pacific Islands region, drawing on a range of perspectives from Australia and Oceania. It will examine how the program impacts partnerships with and within the Pacific Islands region and unpack key details of both AUKUS Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. So, starting will be Professor Hugh White, who is very much well known to most of you. Just by way of introduction, he is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University, and of course his work in intelligence as an intelligence analyst and of course strategic and defense policy spans as far back as even as undergraduate students. In the 1970s, he studied philosophy at Melbourne and Oxford universities and was the principal author of Australia's 2000 Defence White Paper. After that, we will have Dr. Marco de Jong, one of the most, upcoming academics in our generation, so to speak, but also a fellow Stray Dogs front line. Pacific historian and lecturer at the AUT Law School, and he was raised in Tamaki Makaurau, with ties to Papapulea in Samoa, where he holds the chiefly title of Whaimuina. His work details the history of regional politics and environmental governance in the Pacific Islands, with a particular focus on indigenous knowledge, nature, conservation, ocean governance, anti-nuclearism, and climate change. Prior to AUT, Dr. Marco completed his doctorate at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and worked in civil society organizations advocating for an independent, nuclear-free, and Pacific-led foreign policy. Last but definitely not the least, a very, very humble, relational fellow and scholar of our region, and a very proud advocate of relational methodologies. Maima Koro is a Pacific Research Fellow at the University of Adelaide, who's had vast experience in international development at various levels within the Pacific, and also a key insider in Pacific strategic priorities and policies, who's worked not only across the region, but also at the Pacific Security College. So just basic housekeeping matters. First will be Professor Hugh, and of course Marco, and then Maima. With 20 minutes, our timekeeper here, Mr. Opeta, will be keeping us to time. And of course, when we get to Q&A, will be Dr. Eliora, who I can't see at the moment, who will be running around with the mic. With that being said, please, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for our panelists, and I will invite Professor Hugh. Now.
Intergenerational, that's an intriguing euphemism, isn't it? Look, thank you very much. Thank you, Jope, for the introduction. Thank you, Pip, for the invitation. And thanks all for coming. It's a great pleasure to share this panel with some people who really know something about the subject. I'm here primarily to learn a bit about how the Pacific responds to AUKUS, how it's seen, and the most I can do is to offer an oversight of what I think it means, necessarily from an Australian perspective. And there is, of course, quite a lot of different ground one could cover because AUKUS is awkward in many different ways, quite apart from the awkwardness of the acronym itself. Three ways that obviously come to mind. First of all, it's very awkward as a capability acquisition. Now, don't get me started on that. I can't imagine a dumber way to buy submarines. And I am happy to talk about it if people want to, but I'm not going to talk about that. The second way in which it's awkward is that it does represent a sudden, unexpected rush by Australia into new and inherently very dangerous technologies. I think it's true to say that no technologies carry such inherent risks as nuclear technologies. And I'm going to touch briefly on some of those awkwardnesses. But thirdly, I think AUKUS is awkward because it constitutes for Australia a really decisive, even defining step in the way we approach what is one of the biggest, perhaps the biggest foreign policy, strategic policy, even national identity question that we in Australia have faced for a very long time, arguably since European settlement. And that is the question of how we approach the crisis in strategic order in East Asia and the Western Pacific that we're now living through. And I am going to say a bit more about that because I do think in the end that is probably going to be the most important long-term issue for Australia and for reasons that I hope I'll convince you of, for our Pacific neighbours as well. So, leaving aside questions as to whether it's a good idea to buy nuclear-powered submarines, let me talk just briefly about the nuclear technology awkwardnesses of AUKUS. And I think it's helpful to look at that as encompassing three sets of questions. Questions of safety, questions of waste, and questions of proliferation. And I'm just going to be very brief about this. Clearly, the fact that Australia, as part of AUKUS, is taking on responsibility for the custodianship of nuclear material and the operation of, if they ever arrive, 8 nuclear reactors, is an extraordinary responsibility in itself. These are going to be certainly the most complicated machines Australia's ever seen, and operating them is going to be the most complicated technological challenge Australians have ever faced, and the consequences of getting it wrong are going to be, well, to say that they're exceptionally high is an understatement. This is, after all, the most dangerous technology the world has ever seen. Now, that's not to say these questions can't be managed, but it's not yet clear to me that those whose responsibility it is to manage that have yet shown that they're up to the job. And one of the jobs for all of us, and not just Australians, because nuclear technology and nuclear problems have a habit of spreading, as the Pacific knows, for all of us, questions about how that responsibility is handled remain to be answered. The second question is the question of waste. The AUKUS submarines, if they're ever delivered, will produce very high level nuclear waste. Nobody has a solution as to how to store that in the long term. The Australian government certainly doesn't have a solution as to how to store that in the long term. they don't even appear serious about addressing that question. I was very struck by the Defence Minister saying earlier this week that don't worry about it, it's a problem for 50 years from now. Well, let me tell you, as the intergenerational representative on this panel, that those decades just flick by very fast. So plenty of you, nice to see a wide range of age groups in this audience. We'll have to live with that one. And then there's the question of proliferation. There are some real questions here. There are, of course, questions to the extent to which AUKUS can be brought to conform to the letter of the NPT, and that is an issue which the government is addressing, and the IAEA and the other governments involved are addressing. Not being an international lawyer, I'm prepared to accept on an interim basis, until proven otherwise, that they have a solution to managing, to bring AUKUS into conformity with the letter of the NPT. I'm less convinced that they can bring it into conformity with the spirit of the NPT. The international non-proliferation regime that was built on the NPT over recent decades and is actually one of the most remarkable achievements of international society in history, I would say, always depended a great deal on trust and on countries, surprisingly wide range of surprisingly diverse countries, building trust with one another on this. And I do think there's a lot more needs to be done to make sure that we reflect not just the letter but the spirit of the NPT. And it's not yet clear enough that we're doing enough on that. And that, of course, has very big implications, including, of course, for Australia's responsibilities under the Treaty of Rarotonga. But let me turn now to the wider question that I'd mentioned, the question about the awkwardness of AUKUS as a definitive positioning of Australia in the great strategic question of our time. That is, Australia's approach to the strategic change that is sweeping across East Asia and the Western Pacific at the moment, as the US and China dispute, to not really oversimplify at all, dispute over which of them is going to be the leading power in the world's most dynamic and prosperous region. Because that is what AUKUS is really all about. That's what it's really all about for America, that's for sure. For Britain, although I think for the British it's a lot about money as well. And it's what it's really all about for Australia. No one would set out to buy submarines this way if all you're interested in is submarines. It's about diplomatic and strategic positioning. Now, AUKUS aligns Australia with the US approach to this contest with China. And the US approach to this contest with China was a little bit of a complex subject in itself, but I don't think I'm going to mislead you by saying that America's approach is to resist any change to the US-led order, the order based on US leadership, which has framed the Asia-Pacific region for many decades, notwithstanding the fact that the material underpinnings of that order, the relative power of the United States compared to other countries, and particularly to Asian great powers like China, has shifted so radically, so fundamentally in the last few decades. And so the fundamental objective of the United States, to which Australia has through AUKUS committed itself, is to perpetuate US leadership and Chinese subordination to that leadership, and, very importantly, to threaten, and therefore one supposes, if those threats are called to in fact go to war with China if necessary to preserve the US-led order in the region. That's an exceptionally serious set of propositions for Australia to sign itself up to. And I could go on about that for a long time, but I won't. I'll just make the point that that's particularly awkward in our present context because no other country in East Asia and the Western Pacific signs up to that. Now, I'm going to pause here. You could argue that Japan does, but I actually don't think they do. Big subject. Come back to that later if people want to. Our friends in New Zealand are flirting with this question I had spent a very happy few days in New Zealand last month on that subject, but I don't think the New Zealanders are really agreeing either. I think it's Australia and America all alone on this. And that's extremely important for Australia, because what it means is that Australia is diverging quite sharply from all of the countries with whom we share this part of the world on the most fundamental strategic question that any of us have faced in many decades, and an issue that will define our future. Now, I would say that this is in fact the most serious divergence between Australia and the region we live in since decolonisation created the region we live in by creating the constellation of independent states that surround us. And this is therefore an exceptionally serious challenge to our foreign policy, which I think the present government and their predecessors seek to cover up by talking up the extent to which, in fact, all these countries around us do support the direction we're taking, by talking about us, talking up the kind of evolution of a convergence in the region around trying to sustain things like the rules-based order. Now, we could see this at work with the Deputy Prime Minister in Indonesia last week, where he was claiming that the new defence cooperation agreement with Indonesia was the most important document we've ever signed, and with Indonesia, and showed a close convergence between Australian and Indonesian strategic perceptions, which is manifestly, I think, untrue. One only has to look at President-elect Prabowo's warm relations with Vladimir Putin to see that his conception of global order is a little bit different from ours, and also his determination to maintain, as Indonesia always has, a strong, non-aligned, independent, balanced position between competing great powers. But it was also, I think, clear with the Prime Minister in Tonga last week. A very familiar scene, I think, last week, to see part of the AUKUS strategy, if I can call it that way, playing out. That is Australia attempting to persuade our neighbours to support our approach to managing the China problem. In this case, of course, using the Pacific Policing Initiative to resist China's growing influence in the Southwest Pacific on behalf of the United States. And the truth of that last clause was so helpfully confirmed to us by the New Zealand journalist listening into what Kurt Campbell and Anthony Albanese had to say to one another afterwards. Now, of course, for any long-term student of Australian policy in the South Pacific, it was very familiar. Excluding potentially hostile external powers from the South Pacific has been the foundation of Australia's policy in our region since Alfred Deakin's day. And it's always been the case that the primary driver of Australian strategic engagement among the Pacific Island countries has been the desire to preserve what one might broadly call an exclusive sphere of influence in this part of the world. So it's not surprising to see Australia responding to China's growing influence and engagement in our region in this way. But it is, just because it's not surprising, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be a little alarmed by it. What Australia is trying to do, of course, is to press our Pacific Island neighbours to make a choice they don't want to make. Because, if I may venture to offer a view on this, I don't believe their model of Asia's future order is that US primacy can and should be preserved at all costs. I think they'd rather see an Asia in which the US and China find a way to get on, which is going to necessarily mean making some quite big concessions to China, concessions we might not want to make, but we'd prefer to make than to live with the alternative, which is escalating strategic rivalry between the world's two most powerful states, played out in our backyard, which is what we're seeing at the moment. And it's especially the case that it's awkward for Australia to be pressing the Pacific Island states to make that choice, to support Australia and the United States in what one might call the AUKUS strategy, because we're not going to win. It's not going to work. And we won't keep China out. The old exclusionary tactics that were used for decades, which didn't always work very well, are certainly not going to work this time round in the face of a country with the power and reach and interests, some of them legitimate, that China has. China is not just another intruder, it's a country like we've never seen before. Now, I'm certainly not going to offer a view as to how the countries of the Southwest Pacific should conceive their future relations with China and the kind of view they take of the kind of regional order we should see emerging as the order based on US primacy fades. I would just make the point, though, that this is not a question that the islands of the Southwest Pacific any more than Australia or anyone else can afford to overlook. That the shift in order, the transformation of order, is already underway. We do have to have a view as to what kind of new order we should want. And if we decide, as I think we should, that trying to preserve the old status quo is not going to work and that we need to look for something different, then we need to have a pretty positive idea of what that is. So it's one thing and completely understandable for Pacific Island countries to say they don't want the kind of escalating strategic rivalry that AUKUS symbolises and, I might say, accelerates and amplifies. There's a separate question is what do they want and how they're going to go about getting it. I think that is one of the great challenges that the Pacific Island countries have faced in their histories, because this is the biggest shift in their strategic environment since they gained independence, and arguably the biggest shift since the European intrusion into the Southwest Pacific in the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's a pretty big deal, and I think more needs to be done. And I would just finish by making the point that Australia, as long as Australia pursues the AUKUS strategy, then we won't be much help. We'll be part of the problem. Thank you.
Hello. Malo lesufu mau, malangi ma. Thank you, Pip and Jope, for organising the panel and for your comments, Professor White. In today's talk, I want to examine New Zealand's foreign policy and the assumptions and identity guiding it, both historically and today. I want to walk through New Zealand's competing commitments and the implications of AUKUS for Pacific-led regional security. I want to suggest in the context of intertwined ecological and political crises, which pose existential threats to Pacific ways of being, and yet cannot be solved through the security that is being sought for us, that Aotearoa ultimately faces a choice between the Pacific and the Anglosphere. And here are some guiding questions arising from the ways that New Zealand is commonly thought of. New Zealand is a settler colony with an imperial realm, its indigenous islands into Wanuiakiwa. It's a small developed economy in the global north, a Western democracy, Pacific Islands Forum, member and development partner. I was thinking about how people in Canberra see it, and I thought potentially it was the maybe more stingy and less racist Anzac. These categories overlap and are contested, and they also contain powerful assumptions that guide our foreign policy. The late Teresia Tewa grouped some of these foreign policy identities for Aotearoa in the Pacific as good neighbour, big brother and kin. She showed how in foreign policy making, contradictions can be smoothed over or even exploited, and asked this central question, which remains relevant. And I understand that maybe you can't see with the glare, so I'll read what's on the screen. What potential is there for New Zealand's good neighbour and big brother approaches to evolve and blend with a sense of historical and cultural kinship to produce effective foreign policy interventions in the Pacific? This question has gone largely unanswered by policymakers, although we see perennial attempts, most clearly in initiatives like the Pacific Reset and Resilience frameworks of the last two governments. New Zealand invested significant effort and political capital into the notion of a partner or Pacific-led approach and made a sustained neighbourly attempt at engaging with Pacific notions of expanded and climate security. Former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nanaia Mahuta, explained how this, quote, enabled New Zealand to do more, using a layered whole-of-government approach that built in Indigenous traditional knowledge and gender equity opportunities to, quote, go beyond trade, hard security, or defence arrangements and support the aspirations of the Pacific as they exist. Now, as geostrategic competition intensifies, we've seen New Zealand's new coalition government as part of a new foreign policy reset, or Pacific reset, I don't know, Winston Peters still working it out, prioritise relationships with traditional partners, and that quote is used, traditional partners taken to mean Anglosphere nations, and that hard security or big brother approach come back to the fore. Nowhere is that clearer than the government's signalled heightened interest in involving New Zealand in Pillar 2 of AUKUS. I would like to stress that the likely costs and obligations involved in AUKUS membership make this a generational foreign policy decision that will largely determine New Zealand's approach to increasing geostrategic competition in the Pacific. By that, I mean it's going to determine who our friends and enemies are, who we trade with, the shape and priorities of our military, where our aid spend goes, our support for Pacific priorities like climate action or the SPINFAs, the Treaty of Rarotonga, what uses the intelligence agencies collect goes to, and so on. Most importantly, if there are further global conflicts, potentially even in the Pacific, involvement could influence whether New Zealand fights. If you've heard me speak, you'll know that my suggestion is that New Zealand involvement in AUKUS was signalled to turn away from a previous commitment to a nuclear-free, Pacific-led and independent foreign policy, and my contention is that this is not in New Zealand's interests. As it stands, AUKUS has three key implications for New Zealand and its Pacific engagement. The first is that it commits New Zealand's only formal ally to US-led military competition with China. We've heard that from Hugh. AUKUS has required Australia to reorient its political and economic establishment towards the US integrated deterrence and to procure nuclear submarines. In turn, this puts pressure on New Zealand to follow a threat assessment of China and increase military spending towards alliance interoperability. This shift is framed in our public discourse in New Zealand as a turn away from an independent foreign policy, and that has largely occurred, although not wholly or openly, with New Zealand ministers making oblique reference to consistency on China while adopting the coded language of Indo-Pacific alignment. For their part, many Pacific nations are concerned that superpower competition is pressuring them to pick sides, going against the long-held mantra of friends to all, enemies to none. And many Pacific nations have offered what is known as the China alternative, believing that Pacific people can exclude or insulate themselves from superpower competition without being pro-authoritarian, naive, or victims. The second implication is that AUKUS sets a nuclear proliferation precedent, was also heard from you, by exploiting loopholes in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Treaty of Rarotonga. Australia, a non-nuclear weapons state, is set to receive highly enriched weapons-grade fissile material under AUKUS Pillar 1 and host nuclear-capable bombers and submarines through associated joint force initiatives. Given the close defence relationship that New Zealand has with Australia, this has implications for our own non-nuclear security. And we know in the Pacific, nuclear issues are tied closely to aspirations for regional self-determination. In the region, we live with the legacies of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, Maui and Kiribati, and there's concern that AUKUS, along with the Fukushima discharge, has ushered in a new nuclearism. Australia has sought endorsements to offset regional concerns, notably at last year's 52nd Pacific Island Forum Leaders Meeting and this year's ANZMAN talks. However, it's clear that AUKUS has had a chilling effect for Australia's commitment to nuclear disarmament, with Anthony Albanese appearing to stall support for the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and the universalisation of the Treaty of Rarotonga. And Nick McClellan's in the audience who like me saying that doorstopped Albanese last year, asked him if he would call on the US to ratify the protocols on the Treaty of Rarotonga, said that he's not going to. So, that type of thing. Similarly, in the New Zealand brief, first line in last year's briefing, support the universalisation of Treaty of Rarotonga, nothing down on it. New Zealand, which is a firm supporter of both of these agreements, must consider that while Pillar 2 has been described as non-nuclear, it's unlikely that Pacific people find this distinction meaningful, especially if it means stepping back from such advocacy on nuclear disarmament. In New Zealand, we have this thing about New Zealand officials came up with the language of it being a non-nuclear technology sharing agreement. And my suggestion is that relying on technicalities and tightly curated public messaging brings reputational risk. The third implication is that AUKUS has shifted how its member nations engage the region, with a greater emphasis placed on security and concluding market and military access arrangements to counter China's influence. For Pacific leaders, such heightened securitized interest presents opportunities, typically for bilateral development assistance and security assistance, but potentially at the expense of Pacific regional decision-making bodies, like the Forum, and their security priorities. Last week, and you've already mentioned it, we saw Australia take the lane on the Pacific Policing Initiative in an act of blokey imperialism. For New Zealand, AUKUS's instrumental approach to aid and regionalism threatens to displace its own Pacific-led engagement and our source of influence. Taken together, dominant Pacific opposition to AUKUS is based in the belief that its military focus and reliance on nuclear technologies go against Pacific people's own conceptions of security, which are based in climate action, nuclear disarmament, and human development. And we'll hear more from Maima about that. But our Pacific leaders have called to a stop to the militarisation of the Pacific and a united ocean of peace. Pacific nations are clear that climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihood, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific, and that genuine security can only be achieved through people-centred development provided through Pacific-led, family-first regional architecture. This vision is clearly articulated in the Pacific Island Forum's Boy and Bikatawa declarations and the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, and is fundamentally incompatible with AUKUS. And Pip has written a lovely thing about the two regional orders I'll get into later. Pacific people are quick to point out that Australia has committed upwards of, everyone knows the number, Australian $368 billion to nuclear submarines through AUKUS, but will not finance their transition away from fossil fuels or fair share of climate finance and overseas aid, for example, which is pitiful. So while in accepting Fiji's Sitivini Rampuku, of course, no Pacific leaders have commented specifically on potential New Zealand involvement in AUKUS Pillar 2, we might observe that from the reserved responses of, say, Samoa's Fiame, Ngāi Matafa, who, when pressed, note New Zealand's sovereign right to decide, but call for open discussion and reaffirm their own Blue Pacific vision of expanded security. Unconstrained former leaders, such as the grouping Pacific Elders Voice, have been more forthright, and we might recognise the Pacific way of diplomacy at work here. For New Zealand, such decisions are about credibility on regional priorities. Without maintaining a principled difference from major polluters and military powers, New Zealand could lose significant standing in the Pacific. But more than that, when I first wrote about AUKUS, I spoke about losing Hawaii, the place of origin and return, the common heavens, at once a suggestion of a real place. And I think for Pacific people in Aotearoa and Māori in Aotearoa, this is very significant. And I suggested that the people of the Pacific must understand and act in the full understanding that our ocean is becoming once again a sacrifice zone, a military buffer and climate disaster area. And I believe that Canberra, Washington and London have the intel. They see a Pacific region that is facing deepening disaster. But instead of committing to the Blue Pacific narrative, they've sought to integrate it into the Indo-Pacific strategy, intentionally sidelining Pacific-led regionalism and its priorities and undermining our best chance at genuine security. And I believe this remains the case, and that gives Aotearoa a fundamental choice between the Pacific and the Anglosphere. And, that's where I usually leave this discussion, as an appeal to a good neighbour and to our kin. But I thought to myself, in the advent of this talk, what if one were to try and convince a big brother that involving New Zealand and AUKUS is not in our national interest? And we turn now to the dark side of this discussion, and what I consider to be pretty much a forbidden argument as a Pacific person. And I would not be making it if I did not think things were so desperate and that I was not in good company. Because it requires us to think about what New Zealand's deeper core interests and relationships are from an official perspective. Indeed, here we can identify a discrepancy between New Zealand's stated and shadow foreign policy, between a Pacific-led foreign policy centred on regionalism and its priorities, and an Anglosphere-orientated one, arranged principally in support of US military primacy. My question here surrounds the regional order New Zealand quietly envisages, and whether AUKUS would advance it. And historically, we know that New Zealand has leveraged its regional standing in service of Western Alliance interests. A 1981 ANZUS Council briefing, which I have on the screen here, you probably can't read, says that New Zealand's policies in the Pacific are based on the objectives of fostering both political stability and a generally favourable outlook towards the Western Alliance amongst independent island countries. We have a strategic involvement. Our own security is linked directly with the stability of our Pacific neighbours, and we have an interest in continuing to restrict access to unfriendly powers. Our aid activities are planned on this basis. The importance of the region to us is shown by the fact that it is the first priority in the allocation of New Zealand's aid funds is given to the developing countries of the South Pacific. This is illuminating for its frank admissions and the historic parallels, and for how little has changed as New Zealand seeks to pursue coloniality for itself and others. Today, New Zealand is said to have, and here's the next one, now we get into the OIAs, said to have, quote, deep connections and a non-discretionary interest in the region due to the impact events in the Pacific can have on our own security. Looking here at the Declassified briefing to the recent South Pacific Defence Ministers meeting, we see the same objective, similar language. Managing the challenges of intensifying geostrategic competition as a trusted security partner of choice just means denying unfriendly powers. Here, the increased economic and governance risk posed by the, quote, direct human security impacts of climate change is about fostering political stability. Greg Fry, maybe here, in explaining competing visions of security in the Pacific during the Cold War, identified 4 broad regional orders. One of these, a US-led order, operated theories of strategic denial that link economic development, political stability, and regional security in much the same way as this. He contrasts this with New Zealand and Australia's, at the time, more flexible orders that tended towards a self-determined regionalism that accommodated Pacific priorities like decolonisation or nuclear justice and welcomed some, quote, legitimate Eastern Bloc involvement. At the other extreme was the non-aligned nuclear-free and independent Pacific envisaged by civil society organisations and nations like Vanuatu and the Solomons in the 80s. And so returning to AUKUS and the discrepancy, and so I can go through this later, but so I'm the person that's responsible for declassifying all of the joint, requesting through all of the joint agency briefings on AUKUS. And there have been 5 so far. The most recent was released yesterday. And the discrepancy between the stated and shadow policies, we see New Zealand's official support for AUKUS is based in the belief that it bolsters the rules-based order and fosters regional stability. And so this one is the first major joint agency briefing that was provided for the ANZMAN dialogue in February, held here, and it's the first major one under the new coalition government. The core objective of AUKUS briefing state is, quote, ensuring a strong and effective rules-based international system in the Indo-Pacific and a secure, stable and resilient region, meaning it, quote, aligns with New Zealand's strategic policy settings. Oh, you can't see that at all. It's a shame. Yeah. Yeah. I'll say that once again because it's really important. The core objective of AUKUS briefing state is ensuring a strong and effective rules-based international system in the Indo-Pacific and a secure, stable and resilient region, meaning it aligns with New Zealand's strategic policy settings. And this rationale is doublespeak, but it's astonishingly clever. Of course, we know that AUKUS's open objective is to maintain the United States' military primacy and contain China. It means to do so by extending nuclear deterrence, developing next-generation warfighting capabilities, and integrating the military-industrial bases of its member nations. It is the centrepiece of a coordinated Indo-Pacific strategy to maintain a favourable geopolitical order for the Anglosphere. Reading through the coded language of diplomacy, we see that New Zealand has adopted these strategic priorities. And declassified documents from the last New Zealand-United States Defence Policy Dialogue reiterate that, quote, can you read this one? No. Quote, shares the same assessment of the geostrategic outlook as the AUKUS partners, with, quote, shared interests in peace, stability, economic prosperity, and multilateralism, underpinned by the US's ability to maintain influence and efficacy as a global superpower. This is frequently couched as supporting a free and open Indo-Pacific, or translated by New Zealand in the regional context as, quote, ensuring a peaceful, stable, prosperous, and resilient Pacific. And herein lies the contradiction. Even if one argues that containing China could maintain rules and regional stability, or a geopolitical order that is favourable to New Zealand, there is no suggestion that AUKUS will actually achieve this. With or without AUKUS, Professor White tells us that New Zealand's preferred US-led regional order in Asia is likely unsustainable. Crucially, it is also unclear that New Zealand's contribution in, if it chooses to, deterring or denying China is best achieved through military involvement or an AUKUS. History tells us that the most grievous injuries to Western interests in the Pacific have been self-inflicted. Huron Keist, in explaining the potential for, quote, Soviet penetration of the Pacific in the mid-1980s, explained how, quote, French attitudes on decolonization have banked up frustrations that have found outlets in Cuba and Libya. We think about Kanaki today and this talk of China, think about that. How American fisheries legislation has produced conflict and stalemated solutions to an extent where even Soviet assistance has been acceptable. You can think to the compacts. There are countless further examples, and AUKUS could bring the same self-injury. And I have examples, countless. For New Zealand, for a country like New Zealand, deeply tied to the Pacific by geography, demography, and genealogy, and facing borderless threats like climate, UN dysfunction, and global power rivalries, AUKUS seems like the bluntest of tools. It not only lacks a coherent strategy to address complex challenges, but it may also compound them. In the Pacific, AUKUS may be producing the very instability it claims to address. I think to these very secretive US PNG Defence Pact, Australia Vanuatu Security Pact, Philippa Union. In a changing and increasingly multipolar world order, adopting a policy of strict alignment, the lockstep that was recently touted by Prime Minister Christopher Luxon here in Canberra, appears unwise. If AUKUS involvement limits New Zealand's strategic flexibility and ability to walk across north and south and east and west, it risks trading meaningful multilateral and regional influence for symbolic alignment and defence interoperability that's probably achievable through other alliances anyway. Ultimately, any New Zealand involvement in AUKUS must be weighed against other interests and forms of international influence, but especially in the Pacific. We've seen how an independent, nuclear-free and Pacific-led foreign policy approach broadly aligned with and amplified regional conceptions of security. But it runs up against this closeted support for US military primacy and the strategic denial of China. I've explained how AUKUS sits uneasily with New Zealand's big brother, good neighbour and kin foreign policy identities and national interest, even by cynical official standards. I see the AUKUS debate in New Zealand as this contest, between two visions of regional order, one dominated by external powers and military primacy, and another that foregrounds peace, environmental stewardship, and regional solidarity. And at 12 o'clock last night, I put in these last, I actually had this all up there, sorry. I put in, I thought, I saw this thing that Kurt Campbell had done, and I thought, he said this here, the country that has given us the most able counsel about how to step up nimbly, how to listen carefully, how to execute efficiently and effectively is New Zealand. So I'm not at all shy about how saying that they've been the central ingredient in our step up in the Pacific. And I went back and I thought to myself, I went through my files, and I might not even be able to read it because of the thing, but with this idea of self-injury, Western self-injury in the Pacific, and the potential for AUKUS to mean the same. When the US concluded the Treaty of Friendship with Kiribati and Tuvalu in the late 70s, around the time of the Law of the Sea Convention, New Zealand encouraged them not to maintain a security veto over it, saying that this would be the worst of looks. And then similarly, when New Zealand negotiated the renouncement of the US's historic claims to the Northern Cook Islands and Tokelau, they did the same thing. They said that this would be disastrous if you were to try and maintain this. And they were proved that they challenged the worst impulses of the US. Similarly, when the US ceded its high sea rights to dump nuclear waste in the 1986 Noumea Convention, the idea was that You know, if you go on this heavy-handed approach, Pacific nations will turn around and say your ships won't be able to visit their ports. And New Zealand spared the insult and spared some injury. It was acting on behalf of Western interests, but in ways that was acted as also a conduit for Pacific regional priorities. When I look at what Kurt Campbell is saying, I see a different way of relating. I see it much more like what I described earlier, as just simply subsuming the Blue Pacific narrative into the Indo-Pacific strategy. Why I feel that it's such a betrayal is that 30% of people in Aotearoa are Māori o Pacifica. We do stand to lose Hawaii. We have a deep, non-discretionary interest, to use official language, in regional security in the Pacific that is not shared by Australia or the United States. And I make these arguments not because I like talking like that. I'm a Pacific historian. I've come to this quite against my will. I only kind of did this because I'm good at finding official information, and I find no joy in it. But thank you very much. Those are some thoughts. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you very much to my esteemed panel members. The good thing about our discussion today is that we're following Pacific Protocol, where your elders go first. So I thought I'd start at a space that I found myself that I did not deserve to be, because I am not an expert either on these issues. But I wrote a paper on the ethical dilemmas of geopolitics in the Pacific that was published by the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network. That opened the way for me to be in that space. But it was about nuclear. So last year, I attended a side event at the UN Treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, funded by the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network. And I posed this question: what will it take to achieve a completely nuclear-free Blue Pacific? Maloni and talo whanau. For me, I believe the total abolition of nuclear weapons requires a change in mindset. For this shift to occur, I ask a simple question: whose interests are served by the continued projection of fear that necessitates the creation of an environment to produce such weapons of mass destruction? I am a child of the Matangi Tokelau and the Vasaloloa of Samoa. We know the history, the legacy history of nuclear in the Pacific. It's been over 200 nuclear testing that had been conducted in our region. And the lived experience and the impact of that nuclear legacies is being widely shared by our people. We know also that our leaders had the foresight to fight for a South Pacific nuclear-free zone for everyone. That is the Rarotonga Treaty that keeps trampled on. Summed up by Alio Ainga Fituri Elisara, the Samoa High Commissioner in Fiji. Our region has been the site of nuclear testing, I quote, and the scars of fear and mistrust as a consequence of this experience including our vulnerability, gave the region a shared point of reference that shaped our perspective of nuclear disarmament. And that mistrust continues today. We know from the leaders' meeting recently in Tonga that one of the leaders in this fight, the president of Marshall Islands, reminded the global community of the impact of her home as a lab for, sorry, my English is my third language. So sometimes my P's and my B's don't come together. So as a lab for weapons of mass destructions and the numerous impacts. And in her words, we are now working to reshape the narrative from being victims to one of active agency in helping to shape the future of their people and also the world around us. And our Pacific leaders have again endorsed solidarity in supporting a justified resolution for Marshall Islands and all of the people. And that shift from victimhood to active agency. Earlier this year, I attended a US-China dialogue. And a US official, when the question was asked, will the United States sign on to our Rarotonga Treaty? The response was, not likely, because China is expanding. But we know it's one excuse after another. And it is why Pacific solidarity remains more pressing than ever. So how realistic can we hope for the achievement of our vision of peace, not defined by the limitations of military power? I ask again, whose interests are being protected and advanced at our cost? Because our community's sacrifice for the common good has remained a cost to our people and our environments. We are again asked to be sacrificed by supporting AUKUS. It's a forward projection strategy. There's a lot of stories of the impact of this destructive policies and also these weapons of mass destruction. But when I wrote in that paper, I talked about the intergenerational trauma. And I do relate to that trauma in the context of geopolitics. AUKUS, for me, is intergenerational trauma. And that story, my story of relating to that, is the story of a woman. Her name is Tanetau. Tanetau, in my Samoan language, literally means war tank. It is not a nice name. It's a horrible name. So when I asked Tanetau's mother, why did you call that woman such a horrible name? Her response was, because when she was born, I could hear war tanks outside. So I named her War Tank, with my hope that never again shall a mother have to hear the drums of war. And that woman is my mother. We know there's a context of science around this issue. I experienced that when I went over to the UN summit. And much of the research in terms of the science is also dominated by European countries. There's a space for the Pacific in there. So I'll come to my concluding remarks. Our leaders' foresight in establishing the Pacific Forum and also for the push for a nuclear-free zone was unfortunately also based on our own science, the lived experience of our people. Our respect and relationship with the environment and our responsibilities to each other remains our core foundation. We know there has been some positive progress in terms of the Marshall Islands seat in the Human Rights Council. Small steps. And I think here I'll quote, I see Nick in the audience, because I know you do a lot of work to shine a light on these issues. And I'm quoting you that last year, just 3 days before Christmas, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution designed to assist survivors of nuclear testing and restore environments contaminated by nuclear weapons testing. Small steps. And there's also been the joint developed Kiribati, and you can say this word better than me, Kazakhstan or something like that. The resolution that won support small step at that level. And I know, because when I was at the New York trade last year, Dr. Tarcis's Capital Laka, that is not here, was also there. And I know that he also worked with the Kiribati delegation to those issues. So my final comments say, we say in Tokelau, amanaki atu. This is a journey we will succeed. Because as Professor Transform Akurau puts it last night, my optimism is not naivety. The spirit of fear is not universal. Peace is. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together again just to thank our panelists. Really great broad overview from Professor Hugh, and of course specifics with Dr. Mako, and really hitting it home beyond the state and straight to the heart with Maima. We'll open up now for Q&A. Please state, for the purposes of the recording, your name and your affiliation, and of course the specific question that you'd like. Our timekeeper will direct me of how much time we have. I think we have about 20 minutes, if I'm correct. And then, of course, you can be free to enjoy your tea break. Naka. Okay, maybe I'll start. I didn't expect that. Perhaps I'll just start with a warm-up question of considering that, and I hope the two leaders of these great countries have a sense of humor. I was really taken by the massaging, if anybody noticed that. There was a lot of massaging. My prime minister was being massaged. And so I wonder, considering that the prime minister that was getting the massage has been talking about the zone of peace over and over again, and when he traveled here last year, and a few others had a few questions about it, I wonder what are your thoughts generally? We'll start with probably Maima and then come this way. What are your thoughts about the zone of peace and the idea of the zone of peace? What exactly does that look like in the context of what you've just made as a powerful contribution, of course, Dr. Mako and Professor Hugh?
Thank you, Jope. Look, zone of peace, or ocean of peace, as well. I mean, we already have, the policies around peace. We've got the South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone, and also Australia, you've got the Blue Pacific pushing back on anything around that is conflicting in nature. And also the region itself is about that. So I guess for me, I hope it's not a militarized kind of ocean of peace concept, like the Indo-Pacific to me. Yeah. I hope that you can see that in the communique that came out of the forum's leader, that peace was emphasized. It's certainly here. So I'm really hoping that that spirit comes through in what they're trying to do in declaring those principles, and that it's not something that will have a hidden agenda. Thank you.
I share Maima's concerns that outside powers are using a securitized regional architecture to align the region in line with broader geostrategic objectives. I feel like I remember I was here in April and had the pleasure of listening to Reverend James Bhagwan's Epiluhaufa lecture on the concept of an ocean of peace and the call for civil society to populate what is otherwise an empty concept with a genuine peace that centres self-determination, gender equity, nuclear justice, environmental justice, climate action, and so on and so forth. So I too remain to be convinced, but feel as if we're forced to engage.
I'm usually the gloomiest person in any room, and and I'm not going to relinquish that title, I fear, in what I'm about to say. I mean, the first point to make is, of course, you know, there are so to speak hierarchies of peace or well-being or whatever, which avoidance of military conflict is only one, but it is a very important one, because although there are lots of different ways in which human life can go pear-shaped, nothing quite beats major war for real, sustained, terrible outcomes for people. And so although without in any way detracting from the significance of all sorts of other things we need to pay a lot of attention to as an international community and as national communities, finding ways to avoid conflict, particularly to avoid conflict between the strongest states, because the strongest states can do the most damage, and therefore the wars between them are the worst wars, finding ways to avoid them is a very important priority. And it's just worth making the point that wars don't cause terrible hardship just for the people most directly involved. They cause hardship, particularly big wars, destroy the whole way the world works, and therefore, for example, our capacity to respond effectively to climate change is already very seriously damaged by the escalating rivalry between America and China, and will be absolutely devastated by a war between them. So the question is, how do you avoid those sorts of wars? And the answer is, you have to compromise. An old British admiral once said, oh, peace, yes, everybody wants peace, but they want the peace that suits them. And it's a profound and very depressing reality. And what that means is, you want to build peace, you've got to work for it, and that means you've got to make sacrifices for it. And in our present context, that means that we have to find a way to accommodate the interests of countries like China and America and India, the big countries, and encourage them to find ways to reconcile their differences. And reconciling the differences means making concessions they don't want to make. And that's extremely difficult to do. It can be done. The periods of history where there have been zones of peace, relative peace, for example, Europe in the 19th century for much of the time, or for that matter, the East Asia and the Western Pacific for many decades past, have been largely peaceful because people have made concessions and compromises. China decided it would accept America as the leading power in East Asia through gritted teeth in 1972 when Nixon went to China. That's what made the region so peaceful. We have to make similar concessions today. It's very hard to do, and nobody wants to do it. Certainly nobody in Washington does, and neither does anyone in Canberra.
Okay. Probably start with Denwa.
Thank you, Jope. This is Denwa.
Thank you, Henriette.
Research fellow here from Department of Pacific Affairs. Just a question for Professor White and for Michael. Actually, quite a similar question. So in Australia and also in New Zealand, do the government agencies, they have different views on the AUKUS, especially between the DFAT or MFAT and the defense? Thank you.
I don't think so in Australia. I think one of the striking things is how readily and robustly a consensus formed in Australia, not just between the major political parties, but across the bureaucracy, that AUKUS was a terrific idea. And I do think that is a very bad sign. Debate, contestation, a difference of opinion is very healthy. I'm reminded of how few people in Canberra in 2002 thought that invading Iraq might be a dumb idea. Now, of course, everyone thinks it was a dumb idea, but back in 2002, very few people did. So I think one of the characteristics of the AUKUS predicament is that both at the political and at the bureaucratic level, there is a very, either a very robust consensus or a very robust determination not to question what everybody is saying, which is not quite the same thing.
It's a good question. They certainly wouldn't tell me if there was. I would say that, these joint agency briefings do come out as a united front. And I think historically we can look at the role of MFAT officials in contesting New Zealand's nuclear-free policy throughout the 80s. And then there has been a subset of those who would like, to return into the tent, as it's known in New Zealand foreign policy discourse, go kind of back into an ANZUS-like arrangement. So it's difficult to tell. Broadly in New Zealand, opposition to AUKUS is not partisan. Just the support for AUKUS is partisan. So there are people that don't think that New Zealand achieved anything worthwhile in Afghanistan and are glad that we didn't go to Iraq. There are those that think that the nuclear-free policy is our most successful foreign policy, allowing us to build relationships that we wouldn't necessarily have had we had continued to be under the US security guarantee. But these things seem, thoughtfulness on a lot of these questions seems to have dried up. And certainly the public debate we're seeing in New Zealand now focused on AUKUS as kind of a proxy for a much broader debate that we need to have, that Hugh alluded to, about the way that New Zealand seeks to operate in the world. It's difficult. Yeah, it's difficult. And I would like to say that there's been a lack of transparency about the assumptions guiding New Zealand's engagement in AUKUS. And I've been consistently frustrated by the obfuscation of officials. For example, the briefing that came out yesterday did so 50 working days after I had requested it, which they used a subsection of the OIA Act, proactive release, to frustrate that. And they likely did so because when I had the previous one, I made a big impact.
Thank you. My name's Nick McClellan. I'm a correspondent with Islands Business Magazine. I've been looking at the French Indo-Pacific strategy, and a lot of it is about arms sales. Selling Rafale fighters to India, selling huge amounts of armaments to Prabowo in Indonesia, trying to sell submarines to Australia. As a central pillar of the Indo-Pacific strategy, behind all the blah, blah, blah about being a Pacific player, there are those interests. I wonder if any of the panellists could comment about how much this is not about officials and politicians, but about the arms industry driving a lot of the policy and the intersection. Kim Beazley left the US Embassy and joined the board of Lockheed Martin Australia. And I'd just be interested, on balance, how much is this framed, which is the horse and which is the cart in this policy?
Look, it's a really interesting question, Nick. I think as a general proposition, you know, and not just in our region but globally, I think there is, and I might say, including in the US but particularly in Europe, very strong interaction. And I just make the point in passing that I think I touched on this with half a sentence. I think Britain's interest in AUKUS is, you know, 80% commercial opportunity and 20% imperial nostalgia, and zero strategy. I mean, there's no serious. Give me a break. You know, the British pulled out of this part of the world with the withdrawal from east of Suez, and they're not coming back except to make a buck. But I don't actually think that, as far as AUKUS itself is concerned, that's such a big issue. You know, if you're Lockheed Martin trying to sell fighters or whatever, then, you know, selling these stuff internationally is a very big part of your business model. But for electric boat, they don't sell nuclear-powered submarines. In fact, I suspect for them, they're saying, oh, you know, I mean, their problem in life is they can't build enough submarines to satisfy the US Navy. And now the bloody Australians are coming and banging on the door. Cross, you know, what did we do to deserve this? So I actually think, and I'm very convinced that for the US Navy system, and indeed the whole submarine community in the United States, which is both very important and very fragile because of, you know, they can't meet the demands themselves, I think AUKUS was something that was wished on them by those idiots in the White House for broader strategic and political purposes, rather than the other way around. But so I'm not disputing your broad proposition, but I don't think this is an example of that.
As well after that, and then 2, 3.
This may have been partly answered by the last question, but if you wanted to make the critique that it was an Anglo-spheric deal, the first thing you'd do is anachronistically include the UK, wouldn't you? I mean, I get your point, Hugh, about why the UK is interested in being in on it. Why would the other partners be interested in including the UK in this arrangement? Is something I've been confused about. It may not be a major point, but...
Look, it's a really interesting question to which I don't think we yet have the answer. But I do think it appears to me, and this is slightly speculative on my part, is that the creators of AUKUS, the Australian creator of AUKUS, didn't initially think that the Virginia was the submarine we want. I mean, it's a bloody big boat with a huge crew and all sorts of capabilities that we really, really don't need. And so the most natural, if you were saying, you know, if you started off from a blank sheet of paper and said design a nuclear-powered submarine for Australia, you'd actually go for something that looks more like the British boat. And we only ended up getting the Virginias because they discovered, after the Morrison government had left office, that we couldn't get a British boat before the Collins fell out of service. So we had to have something to put in the gap, and the Virginias were conjured to do that. So I think the British were kind of almost... The idea at the outset was that we get a British boat, and the American boat just an afterthought rather than the other way around.
Question there from Michael. It's always good to see you, brother.
Thanks for the presentations. My question is, sometimes these, you know, comments come up that what happened in the past is past. The greater threat today is China. So, you know, whatever happened in the Pacific with United States and other countries, it's in the past. And we should focus on the current threat, which is China. So how do you respond to that?
Thanks, Michael. Look, I guess the response to that is that if the impact stayed back then I guess then it's in the past. But also, we are relational societies. We don't just view things in the time zone that it happened. And when we're living with that impact, It's the present. No one can talk about that it's in the past. And I think that is always, for me, I know this, I don't want to use the word denial because it's like, it's so appropriated in the security environment. But that's just denying the responsibility. That's just to sideline the real conversations and the seriousness of the issue. It's not a past. And we didn't even ask for that past. Thank you.
I was struck by the description, building on what Maima was saying, of the panel this morning, which spoke about, a rush to a new Cold War without, one, dealing with legacies, but two, unfinished business. And I feel like the Treaty of Rarotonga, other things like that, is unfinished business. And I wouldn't be pulling up 1981 ANZUS Council slides if I didn't care about the past, so I'm a really, really bad person to answer that question. And I just thought that in a second. But yeah, it's a legacy, but they're unfinished. It's unfinished too.
Professor, would you like to? No? Okay. Right, we'll go to in the back there. Sorry, Dr. Henrietta.
Yes, hello. Jacques Samuel Pronon from Declassified Global Satellites. I'm speaking here in my own name, not for my company, as a dual French-Australian citizen. So you spoke about the hidden agenda behind the broader agenda behind AUKUS from the US perspective and the need to compromise. Can you talk also about in more detail about the China agenda beyond just expansion? And in light of that, what would be a possible compromise? And is there a less awkward compromise to be found?
Sorry, what was your last phrase, the last part of it?
Basically, in light of both agendas,
yes.
What is there a less awkward compromise to be found than AUKUS?
Yeah, look, that's my life's work. So just settle in, bring a cut lunch. Look, it seems to me to be very clear that in the light of the fact that China's economy is now bigger than America's, America cannot continue to dominate Asia the way it did when China's economy was 1/20th the size of America's, which is what it was in 1981. And we might question, we might wonder, why does China want to become a leading power in its own region now that it's got an economy big enough to do it? It's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer, but all I can say is that's what big countries do. And it's no good hanging around hoping that the Chinese won't behave like every other big country in history has done, because that's exactly what they're doing. What do they want? We don't know. We don't know what they want. But we know what they don't want. They don't want to live in a region dominated by the United States. And they'd like to be as powerful and influential as they can. Now, our aim, I don't for a moment, I never lie awake at night worrying that they're going to dominate Asia, because there's India there, which is easily strong enough to stop China dominating the whole region. Maybe China wants to dominate the whole of East Asia and the Western Pacific. I think they possibly can do that. But that's not the only outcome. The best outcome from our point of view will be one in which the United States remains engaged in Asia to balance China and help to moderate its power, but without seeking to dominate, and to do that in a way that the Chinese in the end are willing to accept. Because what's really dangerous for all of us is one in which great powers like the US and China have a fundamental disagreement about the way the world should work and their roles in it, so fundamental that they're willing to go to war over it, which is exactly what we face at the moment, which is why we do face, I think, a very dangerous situation. Now, it'd be perfectly possible for the US and China to do that kind of deal, in theory, but in practice it has proved to be impossible for two reasons, I think. One is that the United States is not willing to accept China as an equal partner, and the other is that the Chinese don't think they have to, because they think the Americans are going to pull out anyway. Now, that is a very gloomy conclusion to draw. But I still think it's something that we should continue to try and promote. I think the best way to promote it is for the countries, the rest of the region, to get together and start advocating for it, both in Washington and Beijing. And one of the reasons I made the point that I made in my remarks was that I don't think the countries of the region, including the countries of the Pacific, have done enough to define in their own mind what outcome they're after and end up promoting it. It's easy to say we don't want escalating strategic rivalry. Of course we don't. But what do we want instead? And what sacrifices are we prepared to make to bring it about? Likewise, I think Southeast Asia has completely crashed and burned on this. They keep on talking about ASEAN centrality and then don't actually do anything about it. And of course, Australia. You know, Australia, we regard ourselves as America's best mates in this part of the world. We could be going to Washington and say, look, guys, we want you to stay engaged. We want you to stay engaged on the basis that it's not going to lead to escalating strategic rivalry and a high risk of nuclear war between yourselves and China. So please change your approach. But we don't do that. We sign up to AUKUS instead. It's exactly, that's the heart of the failing. So I don't, and last point, the sacrifices you'd have to make, the compromises you'd have to make for both sides would be painful, really painful. But the point is not, are they painful, but are they less painful than the trajectory we're on if we don't make the compromises and we find ourselves heading towards a conflict? Now, one of the differences between me and most other people who think about these things is that I've always regarded the risk of a conflict between the US and China as higher than most other people do. And the risk of that conflict going to nuclear is higher than most other people do. And so I think it's worth going to a lot of trouble and making big sacrifices to avoid that.
Last, right in the middle here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Isabel. I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Regulation and Governance here at the ANU. I have a question that was sort of touched on a bit earlier about the awkward insertion of climate change within AUKUS, with some people claiming that it could be an opportunity for greater information sharing between partners in relation to the climate crisis. But I think a lot of people, by some of the giggles around me, would think that AUKUS is something that would either distract from greater action on climate change or even could be a driver of greater climate crisis for the region. So I'd love the panel to sort of address this sort of relationship between AUKUS, security and climate change within the region.
Hugh made the point earlier that, you know, the breakdown of multilateral systems common understanding is a severe hindrance to climate action. I'd just like to share a story. I was at a Track 2 diplomacy dialogue and the question of New Zealand involvement in AUKUS Pillar 2, right? It came up and I was talking about how, you know, AUKUS and climate and how terrible it is. And the suggestion back was that under Pillar 2, we can have swarms of drones to go do a Haida. You know, we're going to have unparalleled situational awareness. And I thought that was like staggering to me that, you know, New Zealand not only could domestically be turning away from its own climate ambition, but seeking it to securitize climate action in the region in ways that it ultimately can't control. When we talk about information sharing, I would like to make the point that it's not in these highly networked systems that we're seeing under AUKUS Pillar 2, linking, you know, and to use the language, sensors, deciders and effectors, you know, surveillance drones, remote targeting systems, loitering munitions and missiles, that it's not clear that partners' computers are in control. And for New Zealand, that has a serious implication, given that our information could be shared to nuclear-capable or autonomous weapon systems. We don't share those same regulatory understandings of the use of those technologies as AUKUS partners. So not only do I dispute the idea that AUKUS could be productive on climate, but I think the information sharing is a Trojan horse.
Oh, you want to add anything?
No, I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling sometimes, the rationales that people come up with to try and justify these things. It doesn't even worth a comment to it. Thank you.
Our timekeeper would like the last question. Sorry. Thank you, Turanganeta. Please go ahead very quickly since you're the timekeeper. Okay. Is it okay? Yeah? Okay. Yes, please.
I don't know if it's a question or comment. To the point, to Marco's point on self-harm. You know, I'm not Opeta, fellow head damage candidate at DPA. It is no surprise the sort of schizophrenic nature of what you all discussed when you consider that the leading trade partner for both Australia and New Zealand is China. I'm not an IR guy, but it seems to me people don't usually go to war with their leading trade partner. You know, self-harm. Pacific Islanders see this happening all over and over again. So this is totally expected and really confounding. So is there also the flip side of that? Maybe there's ground there for the building of those relationships, or those relationalities, so that China isn't seen, and I'm not a, stalwart for China or anything, but to be able to tone down the rhetoric, because we know they're your biggest trading partner. And goodness, what was the second part? The second part is what my brother Michael raises time and time again. When Australian people and New Zealand people and American people and UK people come to the Pacific and they talk about China as if we should be scared of China. China doesn't have a colonial history in the Pacific. It's not the Chinese that did the nuclear testing.
First question. That's a great warm-up question. Sorry, last quick one, because I can see the team.
There's a reason we're not scared of them. Like, you guys still have ground to make up. It wasn't the Chinese that did blackbirding.
Okay.
It's so that schizophrenia and we expected, but it's tiresome. And so when you guys write about it, can you please write to the people making decisions in this policy area that we're not dumb. We know our history. We know who has been happening to us. So please just stop harming yourselves. Be honest with yourselves. Naka.
Thank you, Peter.
Is that the response? Or? Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Turanganeta. He's from Rewa, so they're well known for the great roundups. Rewa Butter, that's the man himself. Please enjoy your afternoon tea, and thank you very much, Pip. And thank you to the panelists. Malo